Where does papal authority come from? Hi, everybody. I'm Robin Walsh. I'm a scholar of New Testament and early Christianity and part of Paths in Biblical Studies. And I'm recording this today after the sad news about the passing of Pope Francis. So I want to cover a couple of things today. I'm going to give you a sketch of this question, where does papal authority come from? But I also want to talk a little bit about Pope Francis, so we're going to balance out the conversation. So first, papal authority. Like many things when it comes to early Christianity, we are looking somewhat in hindsight or anachronistically at some of the evidence we have for the founding of this office of the Bishop of Rome, of Pope. So many of you probably know that this office is associated first with Peter, this idea that Jesus creates Peter as the rock of his church and establishes a succession of authority to run the church as dictated in the Gospels. Now, there's something going on there that you have to keep in mind. The first is that sometimes actually Paul is associated with this idea as well, because Paul is sort of a twin founder of the church, even though Peter is the first pope. But in either case, you have to recognize that there is, again, something anachronistic going on here, or a little bit of founding. I hate to use the word myth, but let's just put that word there as a marker for a minute. You, in the earliest stages of the Jesus movement, have something more of an apocalyptic movement, I would say, than something that is actually trying to establish institutionalization. Just look at the letters of Paul. And even though we can see Paul and Peter had differences of opinion in certain areas, I actually just did a video on this a couple of days ago. It does seem that there's an idea that the Messiah is going to come back in more of a imminent time period than one that is going to take, at this point, 2,000 years. There doesn't seem to be as much of a need for strict institutionalization, establishment of hierarchy, or rules for the church in the years that Jesus is alive and in the immediate aftermath necessarily. Certainly the way that social cohesion works, these things work on a continuum and they develop over time. But this idea that these guys were popes, or that Peter specifically was a pope from the beginning, I think we have to keep that in a little bit of loose tension with our understanding of the history of the church. Now, certainly by the time you get to the 2nd century with church fathers like Irenaeus, you have this idea that, Peter was established as the leader among the apostles and perhaps even the founder of the church in Rome. So back to this idea of the papal seat being the Bishop of Rome. I understand all of that starts to develop. But again, even the term pope is something that we don't quite see until it comes from the Greek, but maybe like the 5th century. So even this idea that certain individuals or certain bishops are the father, are the papa, are the pope, or papas in Greek. This is something that really kind of applies in retrospect, let's say that. And then the office of pope changes over time. And some forms, I'm thinking here about around the 10th century and going forward, the Pope had a lot of political authority, not just religious authority. Now, some people will say that that has diminished in the modern period, and I certainly think you can make a case for that, but that's not to say that popes are politically neutral, and I wanted to give you a couple of examples for this. But the one that stands out in my mind as someone who's from Boston is that when John F. Kennedy was elected as the first Catholic president of the United States, there was a lot of fear that he would just take dictation from the Pope. This was actually a discourse that was out there, that as a Catholic, he would see the Pope as an ultimate authority, not, say, the Constitution. And so those debates have always raged. Now, with that said, let me just say a couple of words about Pope Francis. Now, I think he was a very interesting choice following Cardinal Ratzinger. Now, Ratzinger, we can get into his history another time, but he was a very, we might say, conservative pope who was very concerned with, let's call it the rule of law, to make sure that everything was followed kind of by the letter. That was what he was known for. Now, actually, in his conclave that elected him, from all accounts, our eventual Pope Francis was running a close second and was actually quite competitive for the position. But he was elected, as you know, on the second day of the next conclave after Ratzinger's retirement. Francis is the first Pope Francis. He was the first pope elected from the Americas, although at least his father, but I believe both sides of his family were from northern Italy, so he does come from European origins originally, but the first pope from the southern hemisphere. He was also one of the first popes who was a Jesuit, so somebody who was part of the Jesuit order. So he did have an extensive education in the humanities and was also a teacher at one point, although he did have kind of a testy relationship with the Jesuits, especially in the 1990s. And I will say that Francis, kind of following his namesake, Francis of Assisi, had more of a rustic lifestyle, or I would say subdued or less ostentatious approach to being pope. He didn't live in the papal apartments. He kept a more modest kind of living condition. I recall even when he was named pope after his conclave, when he came out, he didn't wear the traditional robes. He kept his iron cross on instead of the gold one. Just, again, a few things off the top of my head. He had a lot of controversial opinions during his time, but was known for being something more of a progressive pope. And for those of you who have seen the recent movie Conclave, I think it's an interesting point to bring up here. That movie, of course, is framed within sort of a mystery story kind of Hollywood tale. Put that aside for a minute. We don't really know what goes on in the conclave necessarily. There have been some anonymous reports in subsequent years from cardinals who have spilled the beans somewhat. So we can reconstruct a little bit on what these conclaves are like. And so that movie gives us an interesting glimpse. If you haven't seen it, you might check it out. But one thing I note about that film, thinking about what will come in the next few weeks, the Pope who passes away at the beginning of that film is a not so thinly veiled version of Francis. So the debate, one of the central debates in that film is, will the church continue along a progressive streak? And I can talk more about some of the other sort of progressive reforms that Francis really embodied. Or do they return to a more conservative kind of papal authority? So that'll be interesting to watch over the next few weeks. But back to the original point, where does papal authority come from? It has been essential for the church to have some kind of central figure again, a leader in the beginning with Peter imagined as the one who emerges among the 12 in a position of leadership to create that foundation, that rock for going forward and decision-making and representation for the church's identity. It reminds me quite a bit, actually, of what goes on with Augustus, who was the first Roman emperor and emperor when Jesus was born, who established himself, he used to say, first among equals. And I think that was always the spirit of what comes to be known as, again, the seat of the bishop in Rome. But I think that the continuity that office has represented, and I think that as a founding story for the history of Christianity, the idea of having subsequent popes since the quote-unquote founding of the church has been an essential part of understanding a cohesion and deep history for Christianity, although one that has certainly changed face over time for good and certainly for bad, and one that will be interesting to keep an eye on. So just a quick sketch of what's going on. Again, these are initial impressions. I just found out myself about his passing in the middle of a busy workday, but I just wanted to say a couple of things. If you'd like to get more in depth in this subject, actually going over to the Biblical Studies Academy, this is a great time to do it. There at BSA, we are having these conversations and more in-depth conversations. Many of our members are talking about their understanding of the cardinalships that Francis put into place over the last few years and what that may mean for the upcoming conclave. If you want to think about any of these issues, a couple of things. One, please go to bartehrman.com/BSA learning so you can sign up. You can do a 14-day free trial. And as I mentioned in a few videos ago, we are actually having also a promotion in the month of April that you can get 40% off. So please take a look. Again, this would not to capitalize by any means on current events, but just, again, to explore your curiosity, this is a great time to take a look. So go to bartehrman.com/BSA learning to engage in our conversations there and get into more depth with some of these issues. All right, thank you very much. More to come.